Hey, everybody, it's Susan Lindner. I'm your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. And today is an amazing day. Why is that? Because we're getting in deep into the world of HR and innovation. Why would we do that? This is a story where we talk about great products and services and the stories that we tell to get innovation to the finish line, right? Well, what if the greatest need in the corporate entity today for innovation was actually how we address humans, how we support humans, and now with the advent of AI, how we think about organizational structures and the way that humans can perform at their highest and best purpose, not just coming in as a cog in the machine. And that's why I wanted to invite two absolute experts in this space, Ira Wolfe and Jason Cochran. Now, I had the good fortune of being a guest on their podcast. They are co-hosts of Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization, an award-winning podcast on the future of work with global HR thought leaders arriving to this podcast on the daily. So if you haven't checked out Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization, then you absolutely must. The show is in the top 1% globally in popularity, according to Listen Notes, a top 100 thought leader podcast, according to Thinkers 360, which is mind-blowing, and a top 100 business management podcast, according to Chartable, which is how we all track how well we are doing. I, by the way, slipped 4 notches in Malaysia this week, so I'm clearly very disappointed about that. Malaysians, tell your friends. Okay. The show was also the 2022 recipient of the most forward-thinking podcast award from the People Forward Network. So as hosts alone, I'm not worthy. So thank you for letting me be on the show and for being on mine today. But I have to confess, I thought GGG was a completely different thing altogether when I first found out about the show. If you don't know it, GGG is Dan Savage, the sex columnist's idea of approach to relationships that means, good, giving, and game. So that's what I thought I was signing up for. Shockingly, we wound up talking about HR and innovation and storytelling. And so it was all good. Thank you so much for being on the show. I'm going to give a little bit more about your backgrounds as we dive in, but I wanted to start the conversation off right away and talk about how we're approaching and how are smart companies even thinking about what is the future of work. We're post-pandemic. We're seeing women now post-COVID, right, returning to the workforce. We're looking at structures where people don't even want to go back to the office. And those who do, there's like tumbleweeds blowing through cubicle halls in some of these offices. Tell us what you're seeing, across your guests and what you're seeing as consultants in the space today.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Jason? You got it, Ira. Yeah. Well, very simply one is what we've grown accustomed to for the last 100 years is history. It literally is history. And we knew it was going to gradually happen. 2020 happened and everybody went home. And the expectation was we're going to go back to normal. And all of a sudden we realized what is normal, and it's not going back to normal. We talk about it as never normal. So the future, I call it, is never normal. It will continue to be never normal, just as every single day we wake up and there's some other event in our lives that disrupts what we thought we knew, and it doesn't. You talk about disruption, and there's little disruptions and there's micro disruptions, and then there's seems like there's big explosions, moving forward. But ultimately, we just need to be in the, maybe go to Disney and Pixar. We need to be in the reimagining world. We need to reimagine and start with the blank slate. And the two elements here, and this is the important one. One is there are some places, some businesses, some industries that you can make an incremental change, and it's enough to get by.
And what does that look like, Ira? What's an incremental change that might actually work?
Well, let's talk, there's a huge debate now where we work. Mm-hmm. So hybrid, people, it's not a binary choice. It's not return to the office or you work at home. And even the organizations and the chief executive, the CEOs who are mandating people back to work, and you realize they have to be in their offices 2 days a week or 3 days. It's a mandate to be there sometime. So part of it is that an incremental change might be, again, it could be a 3-2 or a 2-3. It could be why thinking about, and this is one of those questions of reimagining what work is. Why do people need to be in the office? And then what does it look like when they come to the office? Because if they're coming into the office just to sit in their cubicle in their office and meet with the people through a screen on a Zoom call, who meet with the people who are not in the office that day because they couldn't get childcare, they're traveling, they're sick, or you've lived in Philadelphia, the interstate disappeared overnight. There's things that happen. Is how do you make minor, small improvements, small changes? And it might just be, talking to your employees and seeing what, if we're going to come to the office, what does that day look like? What does that make it valuable? How do we make this valuable to you when you're here? What do you want to accomplish, rather than just saying you're mandated 8 to 5, come back to work? But the other thing beyond that is that people just don't consider. It's not only the changes that we make, it's how fast and the pace of change, or how the pace of change is accelerating. And we still think, well, if we make this change, we got to keep it into effect for a year or 5 years. Or we just we hear this all the time from HR and people. Well, we just a year ago, we made that change, or 6 months ago, we did that.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, there's some new disruption like ChatGPT, which was 6 months ago, happens, and it completely throws, it threw literally the boulder into a pond and all the water rushed out. So what does that look like? And I think the universal theme, no matter what we're talking about and what's going to change, even if it's a small disruption or a big change, is that the chances of that being long-term is zero.
Yeah.
Is something else going to have disrupted? And I'll go back to my example in Philadelphia. On just a few weeks ago, on a Saturday, you can travel up and down from North to South Philadelphia with ease. And then there's a fire, and then a whole section of the interstate disappears. And now all of a sudden, whether it's commuting or traveling, truck routes, transportation, supply chain has to reroute itself. And for anyone who knows Philadelphia, there is absolutely no way to reroute traffic other than going through the city. And I'll give you an example. We went to a concert a week ago, and it rerouted us because there was an accident on the Schuylkill Expressway, an accident on the Blue Route, and it rerouted us. And I knew Philadelphia. I lived there, knew the back roads. To get to a concert that normally takes me an hour and 40 minutes, it took me 4.5 hours.
Well, first of all, I never had you pegged for a Swiftie, but thanks for revealing that here on the show. Very important. And Ira, you're the author of Create Great Culture in a Remote World, right? Fantastic book about how to do it. The question still stands. Do we actually need to go back to the office? Do we need it at all? You wrote the book.
Well, I wrote one chapter in the book. It is co-authored, so I'll give credit to the other people in the book. But no, we don't. The ultimate question that people need to ask is, why do people need to come to the office to get work done?
Mm-hmm.
And partly is just incompetent managers and leadership. That when I say that, I'm not necessarily being hateful or spiteful or derogatory. Is that because of anybody who's tried to even teach a class remotely, or to work remotely, or to collaborate when there's a few people in the same room as you, there's a few people down the hall, and there's a few people around outside somewhere. They're working from home, they're around the world. It's really challenging until we as human beings, we as managers and we as leaders get a handle on how to engage people remote, and even more difficult is how do you manage, how do you engage, inspire, communicate, collaborate effectively through a screen and when people are sitting next to you. We never figured out how to do it really well because before March of 2020, we were complaining about low engagement, high turnover, people leaving, people with bad attitudes. And all of a sudden, it became the reason that they're not inspired, not engaged, not productive, not motivated is because they're working from home. Same problem existed before. It just is now a lot more difficult to correct it because we can't see what they're doing because they're not sitting in the office. Just because they were sitting in the office at their desk pounding a computer board before March 2020 did not mean they were productive, engaged, inspired, getting work done. They were shopping. They were doing everything on their keyboards. So it is that we really need not only a new definition of what work is, a new kind of redefine, reimagining what the workplace looks like, but we really need to change how we manage and lead people.
So, Jason, doing this work and watching this, what's at the next step? So, for example, you have a hybrid workforce, for example, right? You're bringing folks into the office. I know my son went back to work. The company started him back with, 30% time in the office. Then it was 50%. Then it was 75%. So like they've been weaning them, to come back into the office. It's my son's first job out of college. For me, there's nothing better than to see him making friends at work, socializing, going out for happy hours on Friday, right? And having that young life, that young professional life that so much of us grew up with, and recognizing that is how networks are formed. That is how ideas get spread, not just in the office, but outside. But I was listening to a podcast yesterday of joy is the recognition of chance entanglements that allow us to know we're connected. Whether it's nature, whether it's humans, whether it's tech, chance entanglements. It's the recognition of entanglements that bring us joy and connection. And I was like, wow, maybe that's that magic of the office. And even when we step outside physically of it, but it's the recognition of like these kind of these networks, these connections, almost like synapses between us that make great ideas happen, that move companies forward. Is that part of what we need to foster?
I think so. So this is really fascinating to me when you bring up the word connection. Before we get into connection a little bit deeper, just want to take a step back, because I think sometimes when we think of stats, it's really easy to think in terms of black and white, but people are jagged profiles. And a lot of times when we think about social science research, the most important thing I learned from my professor when I became a psychologist are these two words: it depends. And what we are getting really clear on in terms of who prefers to actually go in the office and work and who prefers working from home, there are clear generational differences around this. Gen Z want to be in the office the majority of the time, just like you described with your son, Susan, about wanting to be there, wanting to create those interactions and those experiences. And typically they're often at a point in their life where they don't have their own families yet, or they may not have as many responsibilities in terms of home ownership or things like that. And so it very much is more of a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I want to go there, I want to interact with the people and things like that. And then once you become an older curmudgeon like myself, you eventually get to the point where you're like, you know what? It's actually a lot easier for me to be able to work from home more days a week, because I get to be here with my kids. I can help get them on the bus in the morning for school. I can be here for my young kids who aren't school age yet, if my wife needs a break from taking care of the twins, kind of thing. And so there are some very clear generational differences around these work preferences in terms of location. The older that you get, once you get into the boomers are the ones currently that want to be at home the most when it comes to work. And that makes sense given the context of most likely what most of their lives look like at that point.
Wait, boomers or Gen Xers? I just want to be.
Boomers do. Yep. And then the next group would be Gen Xers, and then millennials, and then Gen Z. It's in that order, actually, in terms of preference from working from home to working in the office. You start to see it's almost like a perfect kind of equation there in terms of who prefers what type of working environment.
And is it
However,
also proximity to that like command and control structure that we, had comfort with? And so some folks are desirous of it. Some folks are like, just get me the hell away from that, boomers, right? Who have been subjected to it for so long. And now we find younger generations who actually want to be in those spaces.
I think so. I think the word you use is correct, and it's connection. And I think what we have, I think we've done it disjustice. And here's how. There's a lot more to connection than just connecting with other people when it comes to work. I've found that there are 4 types of connection that are essential between people in the work ecosystem.
Okay.
First of all, people have to have a clear connection with themselves. A lot of people don't know who they are, what their why is, why they get up in the morning, why the type of work is important to them, and how it brings fulfillment, meaning, and purpose into their lives. That's connection number 1. People also, many times, they aren't well connected with others in their organization. Building cohesive teams, understanding other people that you work with on a deeper level beyond, hey, that's Ronnie, and we just worked on a project together. And here's the deadline that we got to hit. The third one is connection to role. We have missed out on really connecting people on a very deep level with their role or roles that they have in the organization beyond just their strengths. But then also the fourth one is, do we actually connect into the mothership itself, the organization? Do they actually believe in the mission, vision, values of the organization, and the type of impact that it has in the communities and the types of value that it delivers in those communities? What we have dealt with over the last 100 years or so in this industrial revolution is most of the connection that we focused on in business has been through the lens of what's good for the business.
Right.
Oh, we just hired a new person. Then our onboarding process reflects the values of the hiring manager. And the ultimate goal is, how do we get this person ramped up as soon as possible so we can throw them to the wolves so that they can be productive and start making us money in the company? Instead, we need to reverse engineer the way that we think about work and we think about people. And by that, I mean, we need to design with the right connections in mind. And the connections are, yes, ultimately it has to lead to business value. Businesses have to create value in order to survive in the marketplace.
That's right.
But that's a lag indicator. The lead indicator is, how well are your people doing and how well connected are they so that they can create the value? Because research is really clear. 90% of business value now is a direct derivative of people. It's not intangible assets. It's people. People create value, but people can only create value when they feel value. And that means that we have to connect them in the right ways with the work ecosystem, for themselves, with others, their role in the organization. And what I have seen is, unfortunately, we've been programmed for so long of doing things through the lens of only the business, what the business needs. Let's ramp this person up as soon as possible, that it ends up burning people out, or they end up not being connected in the right way. And so eventually you have turnover issues, or you have people that aren't able to think innovatively or creatively because they feel like they're being micromanaged and they're underneath a thumb of some kind. So when we focus on the lead indicators, which are those right connections, and we design employee experiences throughout the employee life cycle, from how we do onboarding, to how we do performance management, to how we do recognition and appreciation, to how we do offboarding, to how we do learning and development. When we think through those 4 lenses of how are we connecting what we're doing in the employee experience to connect people with themselves, others, the role in the organization, we're taking a radically different approach than what we've always done in the past. And just to tie into the things that Ira shared earlier too about this disruptive change, that things are happening faster than we've ever seen it before. Quick thought experiment here. Going back 3 years ago, so pre-pandemic, we thought AI, brain-machine interface, pandemics, and alien life were science fiction.
Yep. That's right.
We aren't so sure now. We have Neuralink now, Elon Musk's company that's actually doing brain machine interface to actually fix paralysis and fix blindness in people where our brains actually interface with software systems. Artificial intelligence is here and it's disrupting everything. And then if you've been following any of the stuff that's going on with David Grush, the former intelligence official who's a whistleblower now on non-human intelligence, and they're possibly being interdimensional beings and potentially private contractors like Lockheed Martin or the United States government having vehicles and spacecraft and all these things. I bring all that up to say a lot of the stuff we thought we knew, all of us are starting to question it now. And now we're starting to ask questions like, okay, am I going to have a job in the future, or am I going to be replaced by AI, or is it going to be augmented? And then some of these concepts that traditional capitalists thought were socialist ideas like universal basic income or potentially 4-day work weeks. Well, guess what? Those things may be solutions and things that we have to come up with in order to help us navigate these massive transformational shifts, especially economically, if AI is going to cause the amount of disruption that Goldman Sachs predicted, which is 300 million jobs being affected over the next few years.
Does Goldman actually calculate the number of finance bros who could be out of a job as well? Was that part of the statistical analysis? I'm just curious.
I bet they did. I bet they did. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But to me, it's just all so fascinating when you think about it within that context of, you know, we often say things are happening faster than they ever have. But when you think about those things we just listed off 3 years ago, none of us would have thought we'd be at this point right now talking about the things that we just referenced.
Right. There's a reckoning too, right? Because like this pursuit of endless shareholder profit, as opposed to even just looking at the, you know, what best suits the company, what best suits the company's customers, you know, employees have always been the last, right? The last on that list of priorities of who we have to please and appease in order to get through quarterly profits each quarter. But the other part of that is there are many companies, you know, like you can't go into a McDonald's and talk to somebody anymore unless you're at the drive-through because you're putting in all your information into an iPad, you know, into a giant kiosk.
You can't even do that at the drive-through anymore. They're now, some of them are chatbots and some of them are call centers. Because you couldn't hire enough people. I mean, that was written about 20 years ago in Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. Because I had a client across the street from one of the McDonald's that did that.
Wow.
So I had to go through the drive-in, and I was in Missouri and the call center was in Nebraska.
Wow. And they're fully autonomous fast food restaurants now too. There's like a Taco Bell in Minnesota where literally there's no human working there from order to fulfillment. Everything is created, put together, and ultimately delivered and the purchase made all by machines or software.
Hey, Susan, can I just go back a little bit? And this sort of ties in where you were with your son working and going back to the office and the value and something Jason said about Gen Zs. One is that we got to be careful we don't stereotype all the generations. It's like, oh, if they're under 25, then they want to go back, they want to be in the office. It depends where they are. If they live in the city, then yeah, they do, because they're sharing a 600 square foot flat or studio with 4 roommates, and they need to get out of there. It's the only place that they can go. So yes, they want to go. And obviously there's lots of young people, so the percentages get skewed. But if you also look at rural America, mid-America, there's a lot of young people that are comfortable staying home because it takes them an hour to drive. They may not even own a car anymore, or they have the cost of traveling and the cost of commuting. So, and then it is impacted if they have children or the young, or maybe there's a whole host of things. So we got to be really careful. And I think every business, which we've been egging them on for years, is they need to look at their demographics. Where do the people live? What's their lifestyle like? What do they need? Because if whatever it is, just because they're young and you force them back to work, if they're not engaged, they're just going to pick up and leave and go anywhere. But I think the bigger picture is, and this fits into what we need, if we think back for at least 100, 125 years, we had a grand experiment that everybody had to go to work. Because prior to that, they worked on farms, they worked in their home, they worked in their communities, and all of a sudden they went to factories. But at the same time that they instituted that, and then thanks to Frederick Taylor and Henry Ford and a few other entrepreneurs and innovators at the time, they basically created robots out of people. Is that they mechanized the work. Everybody came in. If you follow our rules, you work on your team, you do what you're told, you'll get a paycheck and you can go to home. Simultaneously with that, we created alcoholism and drug addiction, because what happened was, this experiment's really working. Look how productive especially in the US, we're an industrial dynamo. But the people,
if you're a man, by the way,
if you were a man, for at least for the first 50 years of that experiment,
right?
And then we threw women in.
If you're a particular kind of man, right? Because
white man,
right. Exactly,
right?
You probably wouldn't have a chance to get in the door or up the elevator. Right.
So then, for the last 50 years, it sort of changed. It sort of improved. In fact, men started to take, fall back, and we lost, participation rate for men is horrible. That's another story. Women came into the workforce and they camouflaged the problem of all the men exiting and not learning, and not reskilling and upskilling. So the whole host of other issues. But the biggest issue is that, we have high rates of mental illness, disengagement, loneliness, alcoholism, and drug addiction. Let's have an EAP. We'll treat the symptom, not the cause. And the cause was people were forced to go to work and act like robots. So we keep talking about, I had a talk a couple of years ago, and it was about putting the H back in HR. I wasn't the only one. A lot of people were talking about it. So putting the human back in human resources. Maybe we need to take the robots, and not the way everybody thinks of, take the robotic management style out of the workplace and allow and be more human, treat people as human beings in there. And it's not the technology that's creating this loneliness. It's just bad management. And again, another study that just came out recently was from SHRM about loneliness. Since the pandemic, 35% more people, there's a 35% increase in the number of people who said they're lonely and they're working in the office.
Wow.
So they're going to the office, but there's a higher sense of loneliness than working at home or working remotely. And the problem is that we've totally lost the ability to have that connection. There's a lot coming out on within the field of neuroscience now, and part of that is that they're learning, that the failure for connection. There's certainly a connection and the release of our hormones and other neurotransmitters when we're next to somebody touches you, they shake your hand. There's a sense that we get in the room. But part of it is also there's a belief that it's because what we're familiar with, that there's a way to generate that same boost, that same oxytocin release, the same dopamine release through a screen. We just haven't figured out how to do it. Because basically, if you're an introvert, you hated when people touched you anyway. If you're an extrovert, you may need it. So we're all wired in a certain way, but our inability to create that connection remotely is what the problem is. But we weren't very good at making those connections in the workplace when 98% of the people got up every morning and went to work.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm thinking about, my sister who worked for a large pharmaceutical company. And I mean, this was back in the early 2000s. there were layoffs at her company because the drug that she worked on was going generic. It's a very common trait, in the pharmaceutical industry. And the sales team was given one of two numbers. If you called in at 10 o'clock in the morning, you got to keep your job. And if you got the number that said call in at 10:30, you lost your job. And I remember it being covered in the Wall Street Journal because it seemed to be the most inhumane thing in the history of the corporate world. And now that's considered commonplace. And in a world where we work remotely, you get an email, right? I mean, you don't even have a conversation with someone over the Polycom, to let you know that you're out of work. I mean, thankfully, my sister was already on the line with her next employer, figuring that she was in the what the B group meant, as they were texting with their friends on their flip phones, what's going on your call?
Yeah. Well, and in the vein of storytelling, with going back to Gallup, I mean, they just released it and everybody's giving all their patting themselves on their back. They're going to pull their shoulders out doing it, is that employee engagement is at a all-time record high.
Wow.
23%. The headline is employee engagement is an all-time record high. It's on the upward slope. We've recovered 23%. 59% are unengaged, and 18% are lonely.
Wow.
I mean, that's obscene.
Are these questions we always ask? I don't recall my boss, especially as a self-employed person, I don't recall my boss asking me if I was lonely, but was this happening in the workplace? I don't recall my boss ever asking me if I was lonely unless there was a sexual harassment complaint that was going to follow shortly after that question, because it seemed like those two questions went hand in hand back in the day before it was declared.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, what is scary is when you look at what they consider lonely. So, Gallup sort of took the disengagement and engagement and sliced and diced it in a lot of other ways. But it's really scary when you figure out this is lonely. And this is 1 out of 5 workers worldwide. This is global. And it's higher in certain, I think the worst areas are like Afghanistan and Iraq and some of the third world countries. But even the US, it's 19%. So it's an average. So there, I think Denmark and some of the Scandinavian countries might be a little lower. Again, average. But it turns out to be about 1 out of 5 people. But it basically very simple questions. They say, did you experience any joy yesterday? Did you feel respected yesterday? Did you learn something yesterday? So there were 5 simple questions just like that. And then on the negative side, it says, were you worried? Were you anxious? Were you sad? Were you angry? And did you feel pain yesterday? Okay, all just as how did you feel yesterday? If they answered all 5 of the negative questions, the sad, worry, anxious, anger, pain, yes, and they didn't answer any positives, they fell in the lonely category. 1 out of 5 people have no positives and only negatives, including anger and pain in the workplace that they felt yesterday. 1 out of 5 people. I think that's the productivity problem. And so going back to your point, maybe it wasn't asked, maybe it wasn't, and it probably wasn't measured in the past, but now it is. And EAP is not the cure.
Nope.
working from home or working in the office is not the cure. It's how we treat people. It's helping people with those connections. Whether it's how do we connect what they do wherever they do it? How do we connect what they do with a greater purpose? And the purpose could simply be getting a paycheck, and it could be to solve cancer.
Right. I mean, by the same token, if I talk to my sister, she would say, the last thing I want is my employer to help me solve any of the problems that you just mentioned. Right. I will happily see other practitioners who can fix all of those ills. But the last thing I want to do is talk to my employer about it.
Right.
And, I think that's the questionnaire that you get from your doctor now that's recommended by the CDC about depression, right? It's the checklist of whether or not you're could be clinically depressed. But But I think some of the greater issues around it, and I'm curious because we are talking about innovating and really beginning to
Right.
change systems. And as I was mentioning before this, before we hit record on this call, is that if as an anthropologist, I'm always looking at the kind of international intersection of what's going on here, because it's not just us. And I really appreciate the insights from whether it's Scandinavia or Europe. But, women in India are quitting their jobs. They're calling it the flexodus. That 85% of women in the Indian workplace are leaving their job or considering leaving their job. Okay, those are two really big categories. Let's even say it's half of that. That's monstrously huge, right? And then, especially when you're talking in the context of potentially 500 million people, right? And then, but India's thinking differently about this flexodus, right? Companies are starting to give women off for what they're calling period leave, recognizing that what's happening to your body is actually happening to you, that they're in Scandinavia, they're looking and have been giving maternity leave, paternity leave, elder care and bereavement leave, and all different kinds of pieces that say, we see you. It's not necessarily that we're here to solve it, but we recognize that if we empower our employees to address their needs as full humans in this organization, that they'll be better able to do what people do when they come to work. And the reason we all come to work for a company anyway, aside from just eating and getting food and shelter, is we come together to solve big problems. Like, that's why we work in groups. That's why we work in organizations. We want to tackle something bigger than ourselves. Why is it so hard for companies to recognize that they have to help put structures in place to help us work on those things that are bigger than ourselves, our families, our healthcare, our what have you? Why is that so hard to understand? Or is it just we don't want to pay for it, and that's the bottom line?
Can I flip it around a little bit and go back to something else we talked about?
Yeah.
Is that not putting people on the couch? And again, there's a lot of people, we're not suggesting people go to their manager and say, oh, I feel really lonely. The reality is going to an acronym, and it came from UX and CX, the user experience, is don't F it up. I mean, it's FCDD.
And what is that?
What's frustrating your employees? What's confusing your employees? What's disappointing your employees? Or what's distracting your employees? And remove it. Go through the list. What's their day look like? Whether they work remote or they work in the office. What's frustrating, confusing, disappointing, and distracting. And remove the obstacles. Sometimes everything that needs to be done is in place, or it's being done well enough. Problem is, you can't also have, you can't try to steal second base and have your foot on first or have it planted in concrete. And companies continually put systems and processes and policies and regulations in place that prevent people from accessing the connections that they need, or the serendipity that they need, or the personal things that they need. So just frankly, go through the list. Stop effing it up.
Yeah.
I want to go back to several things because I think there's a lot to unpack there as we further think about connection and why companies have struggled with this. Understanding the first thing you got to do is care for your people. Let's go back to the loneliness real quick. And I just want to clarify something for listeners. Loneliness isn't about being alone. Loneliness is about not being connected in the right ways. You can be alone, but not be lonely. You can be with people and be lonely. I think that's a really important distinction for listeners to make, is loneliness is a result of not being connected in the right ways, even beyond work. I'm just talking about in your life. If you don't have those meaningful connections, even if it's just with 1, 2, or 3 people, research is really clear that that's as dangerous to your mortality rate as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. Kelly Harding did a lot of research on this. She's a doctor, Columbia. She wrote a fabulous book called The Rabbit Effect, where she talks about holistic wellness and the importance of connection, or highly recommend that resource. But just wanted to clarify that around loneliness. So when we're talking about that, it's not about being in a group of people. It's about not being connected in the right ways. That's why we've got to focus on connections. But the other thing that's really fascinating, and I know this episode is going to come out, a month and a half down the road, but just this last week, so this would have been in early June, there was an owner of a company that made national headlines for something that he did. He let go of every single manager in his company. His company is a company that uses virtual assistants, and then those virtual assistants are hired by other companies. So he let go of every single manager. What did he do instead? He hired coaches to replace the managers.
Mhm.
Now, unpacking that a little bit. Number one, why did he do it? He said he listened to his people. When he was asking his people, what is it that you need? How can I help you take the next level, help you feel fulfilled? The list of things that they were giving were all the things that are typically in a coach's job description in terms of nurturing and growth, and had less to do with managing people. So he thought, okay, maybe I can coach up my managers to become coaches. What he quickly realized was that was a losing proposition, because
Wow.
unfortunately, the people that were managers didn't have the requisite skills or the foundational levels or even the aptitudes to become a coach.
And probably not
They
the
were-
incentives, right? If we're looking
Exactly.
internally either. Yeah.
Exactly. And so what he found out through all of his analysis was it's actually going to be a better approach to actually move on and get very experienced coaches who can meet the needs and fulfill the needs of what my people are saying that they need in order for them to be able to deliver their best, to be productive, to have this sense of engagement, wellness, and delivering for customers. And so I think that is kind of an interesting approach of coaching really can be an answer, like what Ira was talking about, in terms of it shouldn't be that hard to care for people and to help them work through things. But the other side to this is there's an AI side to it as well. And here's what I mean by that. There's a lot of research that's coming out now where people are indicating they get a more empathic response from an AI agent than they do a human being in
Wow.
certain aspects of life. Some of the studies are looking at healthcare, and they're asking the patients after they've gone through some kind of a care component, they're giving them a survey of some kind, and they're saying that they actually got better response and better care from an AI agent
Mhm.
in terms of providing empathic responses to what they were going through, the bedside manner and stuff than what they get from doctors or nurses, the humans.
Oof.
Oof, right? And so you asked this big question. It's a really big one of why do we continue to struggle in business with this? And it's like we have these capabilities within us, but why is it that we're so quick to gloss over the ability to develop a relationship with someone, to develop trust, to instill safety in an organization, to be able to respond to someone when something traumatic happens? Why is that so hard for us? And the answer I keep coming up with, because I used to work in schools, I know what we were teaching in K through 12 schools. After you get past kindergarten, everything else is we got to teach them how to read. We got to teach them how to do math. We've got to teach them to the state standards so that they can graduate and they can go on to college. But this whole concept of human skills, of soft skills, of how to work with a team, of what are the words to use when someone's going through a hard time, we don't teach any of that. And yes, there are some people who are amazing that are going to pick up on that don't have to be taught, because it's just part of maybe their aptitude or the way that their brain is wired, that they're naturally more of an empath. But
Or
if we
how they were
want more,
raised.
or how
Uh-huh.
they were raised, exactly. So many factors that go into that. But if we want to truly solve many of the challenges of why aren't we getting greater productivity for our businesses? Well, it's because our people aren't well. That's a lead indicator. Well, how do we help them be well? Well, we need to be able to coach them and connect with them in the right ways and help them through all of these things that might be on their plate that's challenging them so that they can be productive. It's no longer just a bifurcation of work is work and life is life. Those days are gone. And if we are wanting our leaders to continue to have jobs, I'm telling you right now, leaders, you need to be working on the soft skills, because those are the things that are going to become extremely important as you lead in your organization, is being able to relate with people, being able to coach people. That just going through the mechanics, the daily processes of what it takes to run a business, AI will quickly be able to do those things, those types of business processes. And as we're already seeing, as I just shared, it's also quickly learning those large language models of how to deliver empathic responses to people as well. But we really need to step up, I think, in terms of being able to coach and guide people in these different ways. But ultimately, I think we need a model for connection in the workplace that gets people connected in the right ways and in those 4 areas that we mentioned earlier. The other thing too that I'll just briefly mention in regard to this particular part of the discussion, Jeffrey Hinton is a very famous cognitive psychologist and computer scientist. And he was asked the question the other day, whether or not he believes AI that we have currently, is it aware of itself? In other words, is it actually functioning on like an autonomous human type level? Does it have that capability?
Right.
His answer is yes. And when you start seeing these studies that are coming out saying that it's able to provide empathic responses and process what a human is going through, that leads me to believe, when we're talking about how quickly these changes are happening, that we're on the cusp of, if we don't start to level up our game as leaders, as people, in terms of how we connect with each other and how we work with each other, there are going to be a lot of people that will find themselves out of a job focusing on the things of the past that they thought moved the needle for the business, that'll be overtaken by AI. And so this stuff that used to be considered fluffy or kumbaya, this talk about connections, I don't mean to dabble in hyperbole, but to me, this is the future of work, is understanding how we equip people to make sure those basic needs are being fulfilled around connection, so that then it frees up those higher order cognitive processes of being able to be creative, of being able to be innovative. But we can only get into those, thinking back to Maslow's work, whenever other needs are being taken care of by our community and our connections around us.
So is it your recommendation then? I mean, we were talking about the changes that Apple are making, right? Jason, we were talking about that earlier too, right? Of looking at organizational structures that are different, of thinking about how technology is going to walk into our workplace and begin to shift things for us. What's the advice then to those who are in the world of innovation as they look internally at their organization about what they can do now?
Embrace those things. Don't be scared of bringing an Apple Vision Pro in and thinking that it's going to isolate your people. Because just as Ira referenced earlier in the show, who's to say that the dopamine, the different types of hormones, the oxytocin, the feel-good hormones, those can absolutely be released if you're using a spatial recognition device in augmented reality. Like, let's not be thinking in terms of, oh, we have to be touching each other in a physical space in order for our brains to get those different types of hits on the connection level. My hypothesis is, I think that it's going to be very capable to do those things while you're working from home, to develop real authentic connections with people in the workplace that way. And so one of my pieces of advice would be, don't just think that technology is going to become a barrier to those connections, or that working from home is a barrier to those connections. We have to innovate, and we have to think of new ways to leverage technology and AI that can help us solve those problems. Just like AI and nanotechnology is going to help us solve cancer, right? So I think we have to be thinking, if we have to level up our game as leaders of, okay, given these new contexts, these new situations, we have more people working from home, we're going to be working with AI. How do we start changing some of our operations to focus on how we build those connections, and what is science showing us in terms of how we can build those connections, even with like an Apple Vision Pro or a Meta Quest or whatever technology it is that you might be using, and if people are working from home, because it is going to be capable. We're just going to have to unlearn a lot of bad habits and things that we thought were truth for a long time that aren't necessarily true. just like we were talking earlier 3 years ago about not thinking that brain machine interfaces like Neuralink in pandemics and alien life were things that we thought were science fiction. 3 years ago, that's now become reality, things that we have to consider. And we've got to consider this new reality in front of us, that it is possible to build authentic connection and solve a lot of our problems, even with people working from home and working in different types of environments, whether it's in the metaverse or whether it's in an augmented reality.
Yeah. And it's striking because, we think of the word innovation and we always think about technology as, in our mind of what innovation is. But when we actually, when we go to the videotape and we look at what transforms a business is bottom line more than anything else is business model change, right? If I go from selling, blockbuster video in a retail storefront with, and I get to rent it, the difference between going to a SaaS model that I can download and I now have a subscription on a monthly basis in perpetuity, that shifts the fortunes of a company pretty much overnight, right? Because I have guaranteed revenue in perpetuity. And we don't think about human resources as requiring a business model change, right? We talk about process, we talk about policy and what have you, but I love what you're saying about the foundation of the organization is no longer an org chart that begins from the top, but rather it is a connection of networks. It is a collection of connection as the framework for how we build. How do we actually want individuals to connect? And that's how we make the org chart, not with lines down from the top, but rather what supports and uplifts everyone who's in it.
I love that, Susan. Absolutely. And HR needs to lead the way in that. Right. To your point, one other thing I just wanted to share
if
too,
HR
that I think
leaders
ties
are
into
thinking
this.
about this, by the way, I want to wag my finger a little bit at HR leaders who's saying, I'm here to support the organizational structure and the capabilities of creating quarterly wealth for my company. HR leaders also need to be really vocal and stand out and say, I believe in this new connection model as the thing that will save us. And it doesn't matter if I'm at home or in the office or what have you, we'll figure that out. But I want to hear HR leaders screaming from the rooftops about it, as opposed to being subservient to that executive corporate driving, profit driving center about what's going to make us work.
I do too. And that's the seat at the table, I think, is challenge your leaders. You should be thinking differently from them. You shouldn't just be lockstep. Yes, that's what we're going to do. Challenge the model. Think about value creation. You should be the one with the eye on the future when it comes to people, of being the chief psychologist in the organization, of equipping your people to be able to adapt and grow and deliver value over time, regardless of the shifting circumstances and things that are all going on around us. But one quick stat I just wanted to share too, around what we're talking about. A few years ago, I believe it was 2020 or 2021, SHRM had a study that came out that was looking at the HR function in business. And what they found at that time, okay, so this would probably be a higher number now, given where we are with AI, but at that time, back in 20 or 2021, 3/4 of HR's tasks could be partially or fully automated.
Woof. Right.
This was SHRM. This wasn't some other outside organization. This was SHRM saying, listen, in the future, a lot of the stuff that you think is important in your job, yeah, it might be important, but it's going to be done by other systems.
I'm looking at you.
Benefits, payroll, complaints, all of these different types of things. They said 3/4 of it. Yeah, imagine what that number would be now with what we're already seeing with the Chat GPT explosion and the number of plugins and things that can be done. So HR absolutely has to change the value proposition of what they're bringing to the table to advance the organization and the people within it. Yep. And they're at a tremendous opportunity because a lot of the traditional stuff that they've done, it can and should be offloaded to technology that can do it. Now it's time to get to the table and really dig in and think long and hard about the bigger order pieces of how do we connect people in the right way in the organization and lead and drive that change.
Yeah. Well, I want to challenge all my innovation leaders who are listening to say, when's the last time you extended a hand to the folks in HR and gave them a good dose of, design thinking and all of the work that we do on the innovation front that allows us to think differently. I would love to see more cooperation between HR and the innovation team of reimagining how organizations can look. Guys, thank you so much for being on the show today. Jason Cochran and Ira Wolfe, how can folks get in touch with you aside from listening to the fabulous GGG, the other meaning, your meaning, about how else can people find you?
Yeah, for me, you can go, I'm always on LinkedIn, so please connect with me, and or you can just go to my website, irawolfe.com.
Fantastic.
And that's the same for me. LinkedIn, I'm on it quite a bit, probably more than I should be. And then Jason, D as in dog, Cochran.com is where you can learn more too.
Wonderful. And of course, as a member of the LinkedIn Podcast Academy, I'm sure my folks at the Academy will be happy to hear we can find you there. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today and really rethinking how we're going to work in the future. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.